Hi, I'm Sherri Haab. Welcome to my jewelry studio. If you've ever wanted to know about plating or electroforming, this tutorial will cover the basics of how to coat simple objects with copper to make jewelry pieces, and then also how to use other metals to plate that copper. And it's a very exciting process to use for jewelry making and very satisfying when you see the beautiful results that you get. And to electroform, which is building a heavy coat of copper over an object, instead of a rectifier, we are going to be using a small controller. This is the E3 Eform controller. And this takes the place of an expensive, bulky rectifier. And it also has a microprocessor inside that controls the current without being monitored. So it makes a very nice device that's very easy to use. To explain what electroforming is, we're going to take a simple object, and in this example, I have a dried flower pod here, and I'm going to give it a heavy coat of copper using electricity to coat copper all over the surface here. And there's a few reasons why I'm using copper to plate onto this object. The first reason is that copper is very inexpensive and it is also very strong. We get a lot of inquiries and emails asking if you can use silver or gold for this process. And in theory you could, but they would be softer metals and very, very expensive because there's a very heavy coating of copper. So traditionally that's how electroforming is done. And copper is a very good choice for this. So that answers the question of why we're using copper. And then if you want this to be gold or silver, then you can plate, or other metals, you could plate those on top of the copper using a similar process, which I'll discuss in this tutorial. I am going to show you step by step how to prepare your piece and get it ready to electroform using a very simple setup. Before you can electroform an object, you need to prepare the surface and also make it conductive. We like to use graphite paint, which will make the surface conductive, and that helps the copper know where to plate. And then some surfaces need to be prepared with a varnish prior to putting the graphite on the surface. And the varnish will help seal organic materials and keep them from contaminating the solution or disintegrating during the process. Now, before we apply either of these two products, let me talk about some of the objects that we can electroform. These are organic materials that must be sealed with a varnish prior to applying the graphite paint. And you want to make sure that you thoroughly coat every little surface area, even inside the pods, and use 2 or 3 coats if needed. These are small plastic objects and charms that you can electroform. And before painting them, you want to make sure that they are thoroughly cleaned with a little rubbing alcohol to remove any oil or dirt from the surface. And you could put just a layer of graphite paint over or around the surface, but if you have a smooth surface like a shiny piece of glass or resin, the graphite may bead up on the surface, so you could use a little bit of the varnish to help the graphite stick. Objects such as this aluminum piece don't need any preparation at all, so you won't need any varnish or graphite because the metal is already conductive and the copper will plate right to the surface. Some metals, such as steel, are not appropriate and will not work for copper plating. When it comes to knowing whether you should apply varnish or not, it's always good to do that if you're in doubt. Some objects like lace, even though you may not think of it as organic material, the cotton in the lace could interfere with the process, and you also want to use the varnish to stiffen the fibers before you apply the graphite paint. Another object, such as this seashell or a stone, may also need to be coated with varnish before applying the graphite, because again, they contain organic materials that may interfere with the process. The first step for sealing an organic object is to apply varnish to the surface. So I'm just using a small brush to apply a nice even coat of varnish, water-based varnish, to the surface, and it may take 2 or 3 coats, drying well between each coat before this is ready to go. After the varnish has dried on my object, it's time to apply the graphite paint. And the graphite paint can be thinned down with a little water. It should look like the consistency of a thin acrylic or watercolor paint, and applied to the surface. You will only need one thin coat of this. If it beads up, it might be too thin and you may want to dry it out a little bit. If it becomes dry in the container, you can still use it. You just dampen your brush a little and just use it the way you would a watercolor cake to apply to the surface. So I'm dipping my brush in and then just apply the black paint to the surface after the varnish is dried. And again, this can be very thinly applied as long as you get every little area that you want to be copper coated. Thicker is not necessarily better with graphite paint. It will conduct just fine in a very thin layer. After the graphite has dried, I'm ready to attach my wire to electroform the object. So here's my little piece, and I check to make sure that everything's been coated. If there's little spots that I've missed, I can touch those up and add a little bit more graphite to the surface. And then to attach my wire, you just need to look at your object and decide how you will wrap the wire around the surface. Right here I have a piece of copper wire, and I'm just going to fold it up and make a hook here, because the idea is I simply just need the wire to touch someplace on the graphite, and when the electricity is sent down the wire, it will start plating wherever there's graphite. After attaching the wire, I'm ready to go ahead and put it in the electroforming solution and attach the E3 Eform controller. After your piece is thoroughly sealed and coated with graphite, you're ready to electroform your project. Now, to start, I've got a beaker here, and I've got a copper coil that we've spiraled from the bottom of the beaker working up the side that makes a nice anode that will transfer copper from all sides onto our object. You could just use a strip of copper, but we like this configuration because it fits nicely in the beaker. So we have that ready to go. And then we have our piece, and I've got my little piece with the little copper wire hook to it. And I'm using a set of unsplit chopsticks that's going to suspend it in the middle of the beaker. And you want to make sure that your object does not touch the sides where the copper is, or it won't plate properly. So that's just going to sit just like this in the beaker with the unsplit chopsticks holding it in place with tension. For safety, you want to remember to use your gloves. So I've got some gloves on, and then I'm going to pour my solution into the beaker. Be sure to follow the instructions on all plating solutions. Some of them require a mask or a respirator, and they do contain acid, so you want to be very mindful of that. I'm going to pour my copper plating solution into the beaker. You only need to fill it as high as the object is suspended, so it doesn't need to be clear to the top. So I've poured that in, and then I suspend my object. Make sure it doesn't slip off the hook there. You can wrap it around if you want. You just need to make sure that you don't wrap it too many times. Or if your object floats, you may need to use a stiffer wire to hold it down, or use another set of chopsticks to keep it from touching the sides. So make your adjustments to make sure it's in the center there. And I'm going to attach my clips, which will help as well. Now the black clip is going to attach to the wire that's holding my graphite coated object. And I remember that black to graphite because they're the same color. The red clip is going to attach to the copper. And this creates a full circuit that will create a plating effect. Make sure it's centered there. And I can use a few pieces of tape to hold the chopsticks in place while I'm going. Just like so. This controller is designed to deliver a constant current to the piece, which is a nice feature because you don't have to constantly monitor something like a rectifier to adjust the current. It ranges from 50 on the low end to 400 on the high end, and everything in between on the slider bar. And you will get used to the projects of whatever piece you have in here, where to adjust this. It just comes from experimenting with the object that you're electroforming. Now on this piece, what I want to start at is a higher setting for maybe 10 minutes to get a nice coating on there, and then I'm going to back it off to a lower setting. The piece I have in there has a lot of sharp protrusions, and the lower setting will keep it from forming little copper spikes around the edges. The piece will electroform anywhere from a few hours to a few days, depending on how thick you want the copper coating. And you may need to, after a few hours, remove it, adjust the wire so that it doesn't start plating the wire into the object, and then you can move it over just a bit and continue plating as usual. There's a few hints I would like to remind you of while you're electroforming. The first one is the process works much better if you have a warm room. If you have the temperature between 75 and 80 with a little heating pad or something warm around the beaker, that will help immensely. You can also use agitation in the form of a small fish tank bubbler with a hose attached, and just place the hose without a stone or anything else, just the plastic hose, inside the solution, and that will create a little bit of agitation that will keep those particles moving, the copper particles moving. And what's happening during electroforming is the copper is moving from the coil onto your piece. So you will see this coil diminish the more and more you electroform. To remove the piece, I'm going to take the tape off. And don't worry about touching these clips. There's such a low voltage that there's no harm in touching the clips. It's up to 12 volts. So we remove those clips. And then you'll want to take this out and rinse it in distilled water. After electroforming, I like to save my solution and strain it. I use a simple funnel like this and a coffee filter, and you simply pour your solution back into your bottle, and all of the copper particles will collect in your coffee filter. After you've removed your piece from the electroforming solution and rinsed it off in distilled water, you may see the piece start to darken a little. That's just from oxidation that happens to fresh copper. You can put it in a pickle solution to shine up the copper. You can buff and polish it and treat it as any other copper. If you noticed a few black spots here and there, it may be that it didn't plate in those areas. So you simply reseal with some varnish, repaint with graphite, and then place back in the plating solution to cover with copper, and it will coat those areas just fine. Now remember that the organic matter is still underneath this copper. So if I'm going to enamel this piece with glass or some other art jewelry process and I want that to go away, you can drill some holes in here and burn the organic material out in a kiln. You need to make sure though that your copper coating is really thick for that process. Other artists use wax for the form inside, and then they simply drill holes in the piece and heat it over water, and then the wax will melt out and you'll have a hollow electroformed copper piece. Here are a few hints I want to share with you about electroforming. Remember that the plating is not actually embedded or sticking to the piece, but rather wrapped around. So on this seashell, for example, the entire backside is plated with copper, but if I were to stop along the edge and only place the graphite up to the edge, it would peel off. So when I've prepared this piece prior to electroforming, I paint graphite up and over the edge around here so that it hangs onto the piece. Another hint I want to share with you is about sharp points. If you have an object that has protrusions that are very sharp like this, the copper will build sharp points. Often this is alleviated by leaving this in the solution for many hours, and these will begin to round out a bit and also keep it at a very low setting while forming. Let's talk about plating with other metals. In the case of this gold leaf, the way I made this was the first step was a heavy layer of copper, followed by a layer of nickel, and then the last layer was a plating of gold. You need to use a different anode and a different solution for each metal that you use, and follow the instructions on the bottle. Keep in mind that the copper layer was many hours to build a heavy layer for this leaf, and then the other metals were only a matter of minutes to plate a very thin layer, because gold can be very expensive. And so be sure to check the instructions on the side of the bottle, and you can use the anode that the solution suggests. Many people ask if they can electroform multiple objects at once. You can do this as long as the objects are relatively the same size. And the way you do this is you simply wire them together so that they're like branches. Make sure that they're not touching, but all separated. And then you can make one common twisted stem to which your clip will attach to. And then all of these will plate evenly as long as they're not touching the sides of your beaker. I want to talk about a few troubleshooting issues that people have to help you along your way. One of the things that often happens is that somebody will start to plate an object with copper and then it'll appear that nothing's happening. Maybe they have a little copper on their project. I've got a piece of lace here. So maybe part of it starts to plate and then they see some black spots where the graphite has not been plating, and they may think that the controller has stopped working. Well, to test that theory, what you want to do is with your controller, if the green light is on, you know that it's plugged in, so you know that there's power going to it. The next test is taking the two clips, touching them together, and what you will see is the red current light will pulse on and off. For a high setting, it pulses faster, and on a low setting, it pulses slower. But if those work when you touch the clips together, you know that your controller is just fine. After you've examined your controller to make sure that your power and your current light is on, then the next step would be to examine your piece. If you're plating an organic piece, you have to seal the organic material very well with a varnish. If you haven't sealed every little nook and cranny, then that organic material will contaminate your solution and it will throw the pH off and it won't be plating anymore and you won't be able to figure out what you've done wrong. So I can't stress enough the fact that you need to seal every little part as well as you can and then let that dry, and you can even put several coats of sealer on there and then another coat of graphite so that it will be conductive for the copper. Try again, and most of the time that's the secret to getting that plating going again. Another troubleshooting issue is that sometimes your levels will go off just from repeated use of the solution, or maybe you've had a lot of organic materials in and out of the solution, and what will happen is your plating will slow down or become very dull and salmon colored or not work at all. And in that case, you may need to refresh your solution by getting new solution and replenishing your beaker, or you can use some brightener. And this brightener is made with a number of organic chemicals that help to maintain those levels to keep the copper nice and bright and things plating well. Remember, this is chemistry, so it can get a little tricky to figure out how to keep your solution fresh. But in any case, it's a matter of keeping your organic materials sealed well and then keeping your solution fresh. Another issue that may come up that we want to troubleshoot is the attachment of your wire to your object that you're going to electroform. I like to attach a wire in a very simple fashion, sometimes just by making a little hook, and try not to cross your wires in too many places because that misdirects the current. So make a simple hook, or if you have something like a twig, you just want to spiral it up the twig so that the electricity basically is going in a straight line. If you wrap your object all different directions and you crisscross the wires, then you're going to have a lot of confusion as to where that electricity is going to plate, and it may miss your object entirely. So that's another issue that people sometimes struggle with. You can use various gauges of wire. Sometimes you want a very thin wire, or sometimes you want a very thick gauge of copper wire. For more projects, hints, and ideas, and frequently asked questions about electroforming and plating, check out our website.